Am I being amplified? I am, good. My name is Jeremy Teo, I'm head of St Martin's, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Mark Lewis to deliver his professorial platform. I know Mark, our history goes back a long way, and I won't recount it, but when we were both students in the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s, we were part of the same licensed squat and short life housing. If I told you how much we had to pay for those houses, you'd kill me. And Mark was then a student at the University of Westminster Projective Central London, as was I. But I was an architect and Mark was being taught by Victor Bergin. And frankly, I didn't understand a word that he said, which is probably why I'm now head of college and he's given his professorial platform lecture. There's a funny thing though at UAL that we don't have inaugural lectures, but we have professorial platforms, which is why there's a delay between 6 years between Mark being awarded his professorship and him giving his lecture this evening. He's been at St Martin's longer than he would care to admit, so I won't tell you how long he's been here, and has done a lot, including being course leader. I think one of the most important things he's done since he's been at St Martin's has been to establish Charles Esch, after all, which, as I'm sure you all know, is something which we are incredibly proud of as an internationally reputed cultural producer of publications, of books and of exhibitions. And Mark is still very active in promoting that and acting as a sort of catalyst to the continuing success of that. He's also, I should say, at a kind of personal level, someone who asks, let's say, difficult questions as to why we are here and what we should next be doing. But what we're here to do this evening is to celebrate his own practice. And when I asked Mark what he does, he just said simply that I make films, which seems a rather modest way of explaining what he does, which is to make art of incredible complexity and depth. And I think that you just look at his CV as one does when one's introducing somebody, and to see the prolific nature of Mark's production over the last 15 years. There's been 4 solo shows, more or less, per year for the last 13 years. And to keep up that intensity, you've got to be pretty serious about your own work. And it's been recognised internationally through, most obviously, being selected to represent Canada at the Venice Biennale, but also a whole set of incredibly important solo shows. And coming up, it's not like, sometimes when you introduce a professor, it's like you're introducing for what he's done, you just wonder what she's done and wonder, are they going to do anything more? But Mark has got a kind of whole set of things coming forward. The Sao Paulo Biennale, a little show at a little museum in Paris with a big pyramid on the top, and so on and so forth. And so it's a great pleasure to introduce him to this thing this evening. I think we're strange at UAL, St Martin's, wherever, that we kind of sometimes overlook what we have out in front of our noses and talk about what's beyond. And even like this is a good time to celebrate what we do have in front of our noses and actually to see Mark is going to present some of his work. But before that, we're really honoured to have Laura Mulvey to put some of the work into context and then to join for questions and answers afterwards. I'm sure Laura needs no introduction, certainly from all of us who were touched and influenced by her seminal work, both as a filmmaker, as a writer, and continuing as she presented After All Film Club, where you show a movie without telling the audience what it's going to be, and just her reading of that movie was incredibly moving in a way, but to have somebody of that expertise to talk about a piece of work that had moved her. And so it's fantastic that Laura is here this evening to set Mark's work into context, to interrogate all those bits that I didn't understand as a student, and then Mark will talk about the work and then show it. So thank you, both of you, for coming, and thank you for the audience coming as well.
Jeremy, thank you very much for that introduction, and for mentioning the After All Film Club when I showed us in UAL, one of my favourite films of all time, and one that does get a quick mention in Mark's presentation tonight. But it's very, very special for me to be here, and I'm very grateful to Mark for asking me to come and do an introduction to this new piece of work called Invention. We have shared for a very long time a mutual love of cinema, watching movies together over the years, but also twice actually collaborating on making a film at 20 years distance. So between 1992 to 4, we made Disgraced Monuments. It took a long time for editors to get it together. And then in 2003, we worked together again on the 23rd of the film called 23rd of August 2008. And this is just one concrete example of the way that our relationship to film has generated different kinds of collaborations, and the way that watching films have actually produced collaborative work and projects, some of which we'll mention later. And I think that Invention bears some of the traces of our shared cinephilia, a kind of legacy of a multiple founding moment. I thought of it when I was preparing this presentation, and wanted to go back to a particular moment when I wanted to show Mark a film that I was particularly entranced with at the time, a little film by the Lumiere Brothers called The Boat Leaving the Harbour. And so after we played it, Mark said, "Can I watch that again?" And we watched it over and over again, and then he said with a deep sigh, it was all downhill from then on, wasn't it? So that seems to me a founding moment, going back to the Lumiere's as origins of the cinema, Mark's absorption in the magic of the Lumieres, his reference to the Lumieres in some of his films, particularly perhaps the Algonquin Park, and then they come back again in the opening shots of Invention. In fact, the first, I think it was the first chapter of Invention, is like a tribute to the Lumieres, but he'll talk over that. But this presence of reference to different moments of film history runs through his work, and it also reflects a wider pleasure in reference, which goes beyond film to painting, exemplifying the heterogeneity of his works, and a kind of excitement in painting, in finding in painting prefigurations of the cinematic. Invention completely reworks this earlier aesthetic of more amorphous referring, and reinvents in Invention an actual montage of quotation from pre-existing film material. And I want to make a couple of points about this. First of all, montage is a cinematic device, prefigured as it might be by modernist collage, cubism, etc. But more to the point here, it's emblematic of the great collision between modernism as an aesthetic and the urbanized, accelerated, fragmented experience of the modern city, synthesizing the movement of the cinema with the movement, say, of the railway engine, traffic in the streets, and so on. And this is particularly almost, as it were, founding moment for Invention itself, a celebration of modernity via cinema and its proto-presence in the cinematic city. Montage, of course, developed in the Soviet avant-garde, particularly with Eisenstein, not simply as an aesthetic epitome, but as a mode of thought. Bits of films put together without meaning invested in the bits, but which produced meaning in juxtaposition. A birth of cinematic idea in the process, which is then completed ultimately by the spectator, who looks at it and says to him or herself, I see. Now, this sense of process seems to me to be very important in invention. And as Mark's commentary will demonstrate, process of thought, and it's about the process of thought and about process of such. But just as quotation can produce reverie and thought in the spectator, here Mark shows an active form of what one might almost call free association, moving from idea to idea, sometimes moving off to tangent, always circling round back to the substance of film, its material nature as illusion, emerging out of light and shade, intensely self-reflexive, at the same time as celebrating cinema's iconicity, its pleasure in the image. But just I then wanted to say quickly that Invention, to my mind, is a compilation film. It's a found footage film, or second-hand film, as Krista Bluminger has described the genre, where fragments of film, often forgotten, often rescued from oblivion and valueless, are recombined so that film begets film, as Jay Lader put it. It's a tradition of reworking of archive footage to create new meaning that actually once again goes back to the Soviet avant-garde of the 1920s with the great compilation films of issuu. So the key thing is the reworking of pre-existing footage to create new meanings, and typically against the grain of the original footage, suppressing its narrative content in the interests of new, recombined flow. A kind of détournement, as situationists would put it, in which the film, bits of film, are diverted from intended use, yielding previous, unrecognized meanings. And I think there's very much an aesthetic to this, which Mark and I can talk about earlier. But most of all, a visibility comes into visibility, films' temporalities. The way that seeing film footage from so many decades ago, through the passing of time itself, draws attention to the presence of a present in the past. And in Mark's fragments, we constantly see reiterated his love of cinema as movement, and that love of the extended take that's celebrated in so many of his own film works. But here, a new aesthetic development intervenes in Invention, necessarily introduced by the process of montage, compilation, editing, almost unknown, to reiterate, in Mark's previous work. This is an intrusion with a clash with the homogeneity of camera movement, arises interruption, gap, discontinuity. Now, to end with a quotation from Eisenstein, who said, "No discussion is tenable without construction, and no intellectual operation is possible unless it's engineered." And the great thing about this engineered work, highly engineered work, is that it's embedded in the past, in the history of film, but it essentially belongs also to now, to the digital culture of the present, and that culture's desire for the archive, not a nostalgic celebration of the cinema as over or past, but a transformation, a magical transformation even, of the culture of memory. And now I hand you over to Mark and to Invention.
Thanks very much, Laura. Thank you very much, Jeremy. Thank you all for coming this evening. And just want to also thank a few other people, Lynn Finn of Professor Platform for organizing all of this and for putting up with, well, just for putting up with me. All my colleagues at Central St. Martin, that Graham and I now say that I'm possibly the longest serving person here. That all seems very strange. Particularly my friends and colleagues at After All, who many of them are here tonight, and many of them are in Sao Paulo, or some in Sao Paulo, who I just saw yesterday. And yeah, so thanks very much. Scared of this back. Invention, I didn't really know it was a work. It was just a sort of lecture. And it's based on a number of projects. It started out as a feature film, or a proposal, a script for a feature film called Invention, which is premised on an idea of a contemporary world, i.e. today, a contemporary city, where everything is as it is, except for some unknown reason, which is neither explained nor a plot. Moving pictures have not been invented. And during the course of the film, which is in development, as they say, perpetual development, the main character has discovered a moving image. And it's also, while that has been going on, it's also become a number of projects that I'm doing in various iterations of in Paris and in Sao Paulo and in Toronto. And it runs, I think, 25 minutes, and I'm just going to extemporize over it, basically tell you what you're looking at. If anyone's, it runs normally 45 minutes, but it's in two parts, so I'm just going to do part one. If anyone's interested in what clips they're watching, Caroline very kindly helped me photograph a bunch of those on the front table, so you're welcome to take them at the end. And the premise of the project, I suppose, is that the modern city, that is the city of the late 19th century, early 20th century, through to today, invents the cinema, and the cinema as such, that is the thing that we see projected, or that increasingly we don't see projected on screens, but historically projections is a kind of imitation of that effect. That is the shadows, the movements, the reflections, all of this kind of concentration of effect that is made possible by a modern city of glass buildings, mirrored surfaces, shadows that move, and so on and so forth. But also that this idea of the city, of the cinema being invented by the city itself, is actually the culmination or the accomplishment that all of the art forms to date have been struggling to try to articulate and perform. That is, how do you depict movement, how do you depict motion, how do you depict time. And it's, the idea for me is that the cinema itself, film, television, and other digital forms are in a sense the commodification of that effect. That is, what used to be free you now pay for. And in a way, it's my work. Without knowing it, I've been making this work for 15, 20 years, starting with my first film that I made with Laura. You said that our last film was in 2003. It was 2013. It was died. It's very recent. Okay. Maybe okay, I'm going to hopefully. Okay. So the cinema begins, obviously, with the projected cinema begins with the Lumiere Brothers, and one of the most obvious things when you look at the Lumiere films is this fascination with the way in which the world itself is already producing its own effects. That is, here we're going up the Eiffel Tower. Can we just, which light is throwing the shadow on it? It's mine. And it's like moving up frames, like cinematic frames. machining. Here we have sort of military exercises, and it produces the effect of the screen onto which the film is being projected. These are, there are little clips of the Lumiers, which some of them are longer. And here, a beautiful film of the Goldfish Bowl. We see the world inverted upside down in the screen, so it's already an optic, it's like the lens of the camera. It's already producing an image of the city or of the countryside, whatever that is. The fascination of the time when the films were invented of moving platforms, moving sidewalks, each of them producing a kind of cinematic effect. An effect that I want to emphasize is before the cinema. So all around the modern world, the modern city, is this effect of movement, of frames, of kind of ingrained experience of motion that pre-exists the cinema itself. The tennis match, a very simple structure of wood creates the idea. For me, already we see inside the film a mise en abîme. We have the film within the film. I don't mean to suggest that the Lumières or anyone else was conscious of this, but I think that naturally the machine that they were working with was naturally drawn to these effects. Here, the famous film with the cat, we have the image of the world outside as a movie. In mise en abîme, we have a movie outside. The cat, of course, not being interested in the movies is completely oblivious to it. I started with the one part of the diptych going into the tunnel, and now the other diptych of coming out of the tunnel, and we see the. Okay, now I'm going to show you small clips of my own films, which this is called the moving image. It's shot in the work. It's only a part of it. But here, I try to understand the way in which I never know that I'm doing this, but now I can see retrospectively the way in which the world itself is producing these kinds of effects of movement and cinematic experience. So inside of the Opera House in Warsaw's elevator, we have this kind of cinemascope effect and the entry into the world of cinema. I talked about here, this is a film of mine from 2005, or a small clip of it called Rush Hour. The concentration of shadows in the city, now here shot upside down, produced the effect of a kind of a very, very simple animation, cinematic animation. Here, the modern buildings, the Mies van der Rohe building in Toronto, just walking past the mullions of this 54th floor building, one gets two planes of movement, the foreground prospectively moves faster than the background, and you get this kind of frame effect produced by simply walking past it. These buildings themselves are machines for cinema or for movement, or for understanding movement. This is I noticed today, Janice was telling me, that almost all the buildings of the Hague estate are gone, but this was a film or a clip from 2002 called Children's Games. And you can see that in the very architecture of this building, which is obviously heavily influenced by Corbusier and others, you have a kind of ready-made of the cinema. This machine, the building itself is a machine for movement. These passageways in the air, which are so important to the modern architects, are ways in which the body can be propelled through space, very much like a cinematic experience. And Benjamin talks about how modern architecture produces the cinema reverse. It's a mobile spectator rather than a fixed spectator. This is from the L'Est Man by Murnau, and the revolving doors invented more or less simultaneously with the cinema. So you can see, it's no accident that early silent films were fascinated with these devices, because these devices returned the machine of cinema back to itself. I wish it was invented before cinema. It was invented 4 years after, before it was simultaneous. Also from the L'Est Man, the elevator shaft. also produces the same effect that you saw with the Lumieres, and now they'll go back out to the all indoors. Literally a frame machine. And silent cinema, early silent cinema was fascinating with this effect, seemed to find it preternaturally, and also partly because plot wasn't so essential. So what they didn't get here is from Lonesome, a 1926 film by Paul Fejas. The framing device, the use of the foreground and background, the movement through space, all of them producing a kind of cinematic effect, or finding the cinematic effect as it already exists. Famous film Sunrise by Bruno. We see the dancing ballroom scene, which is like a movie. It uses the framing of the windows to produce a separate frame. And then just to go over here, I'm going to freeze frame here, or at least it should freeze frame. You see that Bruno's using rear projection. And he makes a kind of equivalence between the rear projection screen there of the fairground film somewhere else and his ballroom scene. So in a way, they're both screens, they're both cinema. Here we have a scene from Marcel Herbiers' Le Humain, the shadow play. Early cinema was fascinating with shadows. Shadows precisely. Here's, I gotta keep faster, You and Me by Fritz Lang. They're watching shadows. And now this brings me to the Adoration of Magic by Conrad Ditz from 1443. And we already see in the shadow of the young Jesus that he's in a different motion. It's too fast for me to keep up. But basically, it's an early way for painting to depict movement by having the shadow, here's Duchamp, having the shadow in a different position. I was just in Sao Paulo, and this is a beautiful building from the 30s, it's called the Orion Building. The sun behind the sign casts the shadow, so buildings talk as well. Here it is, just going from the sign, it's a very quick shot on my iPhone, to its shadow, cast perpetually. So it's the building actually has a language. It casts shadows, but it speaks. Anyways, Bar the Folie Bergère, this idea of two times, two spaces. Painters have tried to produce that. You know that the reflections in a different place than the original. This is my film, Smoker at Spitalfields, where I took the right-hand side, which is a reflection, and I speeded it up 6 frames. So everything in the mirror side happens 6 frames before. As you'll see as this woman walks in, she walks in a reflection. So she sees the future. We see the future on the right, so we split it into 2 moments. It goes on for much longer. It's just a little clip. This is a film called The House in Trevina Street by Boris Barnett from 1928. It's notable, thank you to Laura, that Victor Shklovsky designed this sequence where you see that you can go backwards and you can freeze frame. So in a way, the invention of film is there. Okay, this is a scene from Hindle Waits, and even the basic movement of the bodies creates is the effect of cinema. So the cinema is searching it out. I should have timed this, it's going much faster than I want to. This is Études sur Paris by Henri Sauvage. Again, the cinema of the street and the modern city producing cinema. Asphalt by Joe May. Beautiful sequence where we see the city coming alive as a movie. So to me, he's filming the city as cinema. Everything you see is kind of like a cinematic effect. You don't need the film to experience this, but he's pulled it through. This beautiful sequence here from Day to Night. I think this was the last silent film shot in Berlin. Or the last major silent film. And here, everything you see is like movies within movies. There's the bus going by, there's the shadows moving in the shop above. And here now is a live scene inside a window, which is like another film, which we'll see in a second. A woman showing off her stockings, or selling stockings, sorry. Helpfully subtitled for you. This is a film called International House from 1933. It's a talkie by Edward Sutherland, but I thought it was useful to include because in a way it gives the idea that the cinema has that the camera itself has agency, that it's not just, and I think you'll see that this agency is rather perverse. This is little clips from Kubrick's Killer's Kiss. But everywhere the camera cuts away to see movement, motion in the city, small little things creating these kind of motion effects. And then the famous scene from Possessed by Clarence Brown in 1931, watching the different movies go past in the train as she dreams of leaving her small town. Stock music again. This is a promotional film called Studio Tour for MGM's silent film, 1925, sorry. And it's demonstrating the use of mobile camera. And I just thought this was a rather beautiful early sequence to show how, and here's the film. I was going to ask Laura what that film was, if anyone knows. I never discovered it. Here's the shot they made. It's beginning to show that the camera is mobile and not only is it mobile, but it doesn't seem to be occupied with gravity or real space. This is from Laura's film that she talked about, Lascivione Tutti. Again, Offals was not in the silent era, but he was definitely interested in this idea of the camera having a kind of mobility in her life. It can go through walls, it's not struck by gravity. Here's another film by him called La Ronde, which is a beautiful shot where he, like all of his films, where the mobility of the camera sets up a foreground and a background, which in a way creates kind of, again, it's mise en abîme cinema within cinema. These are common shots now, but many of these shots were invented by Offals. And I freeze framed it here because it's like a rear projection. He didn't like rear projection, but here from Letter from an Unknown Woman, he used a moving panorama to create not only a cinematic effect, but to make a kind of comment, I think, about rear projection, which he hated. Saboteur by Hitchcock. Here we are. This is real classic rear projection. They're dancing on a turntable behind them. Projected our dancers. Rear projection is a kind of film within film, so we see cinema's love affair with itself as a kind of, and I thought I would include this one. The sound didn't come on, but anyway. Here it is. This is called Panorama Blue by Alan Roberts in 1974. This is from Homeland, a recent TV show, where you see that the reflection in the mirror and the window very much mimic the effect of rear projection. This is Posting Almost Rings Twice, a beautiful sequence where they're swimming. This is my homage to that film, I suppose. This is a short clip from Third Beach, trying to use the day for night technique, which the French call le nuit américaine. But thinking about it in painting, if we look at this view of Dresden by Moonlight, which my friend Craig and I saw together in Dresden, and this is Night Seaport by Moonlight by Claude Vernet at the Louvre in Paris, and now we're running very fast, I should have made these longer. This is Landscape the Stone Carrots by Peter Paul Rubens, Judith Slater Lafayette, of course, by Artemisia, and The Finding of the Body of St. Mark by Tintoretto. Tintoretto invents, I'm going to just pause because I'm losing my, just for 10 seconds at this point. It was while looking at Tintoretto in Rome that I realized that the French had it wrong. It wasn't La Nuit Américaine, which they called day for night, where you shoot the day pretending it's and darken it by using red filtration and reducing your exposure. But in fact, it was not the Italian, because it was the Italians who learned how to use the Renaissance, how to use the light of the day to pretend it was the night. And that's what I was trying to get to in that rapid. And then, beautifully, in that sequence, we have a little cinema seat at the back, returning me to this sequence. Was Menzel. I put Menzel in there because I was just loving it. And I could think, and so I'm way too fast today. So this is Bellini, but two Bellinis. Again, separation of the foreground and the background. Jan van Eyck, the Roland painting at the Louvre. All these paintings are in here to suggest that this idea of separation of foreground and background are invented by painting, that cinema in a way imitates it. And cinema imitates it unconsciously, maybe, but it imitates it. This is Stanley Kubrick from the same film, Killer's Kiss, where we see something of the same composition of Jan van Eyck. He's watching that woman get undressed in a mirror reflected, in a window reflected in his mirror. Oh, gosh. I wanted to keep it to 25 minutes, so I kept shortening the clips. This is one of my favorite movies of all time. Anthony Mann's The Tin Star. This is Henry Fonda's best film, and probably Anthony Perkins' only real good performance. It speaks for itself. It's not a city. It's set in the city. Mann uses the windows to create film within film. Again, Mann's one of the greatest of the Hollywood film directors. Underappreciated, I think, but he's up there with the best, I think. It's just a great use of the foreground background to create this idea that all film can do is discover film. That's all it wants to do. All the camera wants to do is to find itself filming something that looks like a film. And the best directors, I think, let that happen. This is from Lonesome. It's so obvious I don't have to say. One of the great filmmakers, again, Jacques Tournier. This is Stars in My Crown. Again, these little boys are experiencing the film effect lying on the. This is one of the most beautiful shots in cinema, I think, in my opinion. And here we are watching the movies. And then this is too obvious again. This is 400 Blows by Truffaut. Again, it's the cinematic effect of the machine that produces what the cinema can do already. This is from Lonesome again, and again, the early cinema was fascinating with the fairground, because the fairground had machines to do exactly what he was trying to do, turn things around. But they weren't the first, trying to understand what that meant. The social mixer. You should try that more often. It's like an old-fashioned grinder. Boy Look Spinning Top by Chardin. I just did this little spin thing, but it's obvious, this is a movie. This is a cinema of all of that, little boys trying to understand. And now I thought I'd just show a part of my film, North Circular, which actually was shot on North Circular at a building by the Red Cross Shopping Center, which is now gone. Not right across the building. I think right across the bigger. And this is a painting. No, this is a film. That obviously is very influenced by Chardin. Laura was talking about influence before and reference, and it's funny how that happens. In the beginning, when making films, I was much more keen to make direct references, and now I feel increasingly confident that the machine itself can make those references for me. I hope you. I think of his films like a love affair between the camera and the spinning top. Both of these kind of old-fashioned mechanical machines, both designed to create the illusion of movement, or some kind of impossible illusion, some different illusions. And both have to expire. Strange thing happened when I was in Sao Paulo at the MAS, the Museum of Art. I discovered I'm actually working with that painting at the moment, a project that I'm doing at the Louvre. And a week after I'd been to the Louvre to do some preparatory work around the Chardin painting, which is in a collection, I went to the MAS and I saw it on the wall of the MAS in Sao Paulo. I thought, how can that be possible? But I just thought in a week ago. Of course, I assumed they didn't know the Chardin had done two versions. This is painting by Sasetta that I'm very fascinated with. Again, it's an early attempt to try and understand movement. This is the beautified monk Ranieri freeing prisoners, but as you can see, the sort of motion blur out of his rear. And this is a clip from a new film of mine, which I'm in the middle of working on, which is called, I don't remember the name of what I'm doing. It's called Motion Picture Camera Moving Slowly Through a Picture Gallery. Which is exactly what it's doing, and to try to understand the difference between, I don't know, try to understand the difference between what happens in a gallery in terms of photographing, selfies, cameras, and the world's most famous painting. It's a very strange experience being there. I've been there many, many days. Is that when people get to this space, I don't mean to demean them or to humiliate them or to make fun of them, but people don't really know what to do. They really don't know what to do. What's interesting is they don't look at the camera, because obviously it's a big camera going through with the crew. Talk about that later maybe. This is a very underrated, Robert Siamak, a very underrated film director. This is called The Killers. And he, this is a shot where it's all done in one continuous shot. The continuous shot, which in a way has become, for many people in cinema, a kind of macho thing about how long a shot can go on for without a break. It's become the sign of a certain, or signature of a certain kind of art film. Certainly, a lot of my films are very long single shots. But I like this because I like this. It's a beautiful shot. It's just beautiful. But it also, he's retelling the story of a robbery. It's not really that important. It's filmed on a film lot, and they just dressed it up to look like a factory. I chose this tape because it's a way in which you'll see in a second what happened. I was telling Laura that when I've been editing the bigger picture of this, well, I'll take a minute. So here, Siamak filming this. There we go. We see the crew in the window. I've just rewound it and froze it. So we see the crew. It's almost like the machine couldn't help but find itself. That it's kind of self-reflexivity that he would never have imagined somebody would be able to stop it and look at it like I've been able to. And it's about the way in which vehicles themselves become synonymous with the moving image. The modern car, the train, any vehicle that moves creates a kind of ability to, through reflection and through movement through space, to kind of cinematic effect. I'll just let them finish shooting at each other. And so here we are, End of Watch. It's a recent film that I picked it because you can see the car itself becomes a movie theater. Just is able to show the world as it moves through. And this is Antonio's first film, I think. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right. Pro-Vice lots of Italians in here, Gian Amore. Again, the way in which the car itself becomes a possibility for all things cinematic. And here's a beautiful scene from Anthony Mann's Side Street. It's just to prove the point. You've seen this shot dozens of times, or a version thereof, but maybe not quite as beautiful as this one. And to make the point, here's another version of exactly the same shot, and I've forgotten the name of the film. And just to finish, this is the last series. It's Playtime. Jacques Tati, I think, really understood what, I don't know what I've been talking about, but if there is any idea inside of it around the relationship between cinema and the cinematic effect, Jacques Tati understood it in the city, that is, and here in Playtime, everything you see is a kind of articulation of the way in which the modern world creates a kind of cinematic effect. I'm going to, I think this is almost the last. I think this is probably, one of the greatest films ever. And so intelligent, so smart, and so contemporary. And of course, Paris exists as sort of cinematic effects and reflections. And that, I believe, is the end of part one. And I'm just not here.
That was an incredible tour de force. And managed to begin and end with the Eiffel Tower. Did you do that on purpose?
No, but next time I'm going to say that. But thank you for that. I also want to say special thanks to Laura. I don't think I emphasize that enough, but so much of my work over the years has been developed in conversation with Laura and through suggestions and through and one of the, even in this invention, she's been very influential and helpful in trying to make it a better piece. So thank you.
Well, I don't know about that. But also, I think the piece we worked on, was it about a month ago?
A little more, but yes.
Yes. It just proves the point about free association and flow, and the way that it's expanded, contracted, acquired more images, lost other images. So I think it does give the sense of being almost a living object. Did you say that at the beginning? Yeah.
I think I said that to you before.
Which is one of the ways in which it's both very, very deeply ingrained in the cinematic past, but at the same time has that life that only the digital can give it. But Mark and I would like, is there any way we can move the lighting around a little bit?
So the audience can have light? Audience can have light?
Yeah. We can just
Kind of equalize it.
Yes, that's right. Now, Mark and I thought that we would just fuse the remarks that we wanted to make to each other with any remarks that people sitting here in the audience might like to contribute as well. So we can carry on for about another 20 minutes. Is there anything anyone would like to start off with, or Mark would like to just keep going on? It's quite difficult for us to see, so if you do have something to say, you could wave.
Great, sorry to start, but I wonder if you could start by defining what you mean by cinematic and cinematic effect, because throughout your tour, which was great, you kept saying this is cinematic or that is a cinematic effect. And I wasn't quite sure what you meant, whether it was depiction of movement or framing or all of these things.
I think it's you're probably right. I probably used the term too freely, and I think that it's all of those things. I think what I try to argue, of course, it's a little bit of a conceit, is that everything that we understand about the cinema already exists, and that all those things, framing, shadowing, illumination, darkness, For instance, if you think about the two trains of Lumiere, one going in, one going out of the tunnels, that's fade up, fade down. So your experience of being in a train going in a tunnel is you've experienced the fading up of the cinema, the fading down since the invention of trains, which precedes the invention of cinema. That's just a small detail, but all of these are the cinematic effects that cinema, in a way, inscribes as its language. But what we can argue is that all those things already exist, and that in a way the cinema just learns from the city. It learns. It copies it. It copies the world in order to. I'm also assuming by that we suspend anything to do with story. A lot of affairs, this kind of thing. And we're just, if we think of the Lumiere films and the films shortly thereafter as a kind of fascination with itself in the world. So a fascination with what already existed in the world that was like it before the fact. Does that make sense?
Well, I think we might want to distinguish a little bit more between two kinds of movement: the movement of the camera and the camera's attraction to what it sees in front of it. We were talking about this earlier when you said that you loved sequences with wind blowing, as the wind seemed to represent, allegorize the movement of the camera, became the movement of the camera, the breathing of the cinema, as it were. But then at the same time, the camera also loves seeing the movement of the wind in the trees. Again, going back to the famous Lumiere film, where the spectators were fascinated not by what the figures in front of the camera were doing, but the actual movement of the leaves when they were blown by the wind. So, in some ways, although your polemical point, I think, works very well, especially in terms of the city, there are ways in which the cinema, or the camera, the cinema, whatever, also just loves watching movement as such. And I think there are lots of moments in Invention where that becomes clear.
I agree. I think that it's interesting that there are three. When people talk about the invention of projective film, they say there are three moments of surprise or three moments of strangeness. And with the invention of film, one is that and I don't get into these until later on in the montage, which in part two, is the first thing is seeing something move for the first time. Second thing is to see something prosaic and ordinary, like trees moving for the first time, because people are familiar with seeing people acting and being in the theater. They've been to various magic lanterns, so it's not new. Nobody was ducking under the seats from the train. But what they hadn't really seen is reproduction of this kind of anarchic and abstract movement of the wind, movement of trees, the things that you can't imitate, you can't create a reproduction of it, heretofore. And the third thing is the strangeness that they experience, or the delight they experience at imagining themselves as films. But I'll talk about like seeing themselves filmed for the first time before vanity, before kind of expectation of how they might look. So, Craig, you obviously got a response to the thing about cinematic effect.
No, not really. That's helpful. But I wonder if you could talk about duration as well, then, because I thought that was really important. So that, so even in your own films, they're loop, but duration is very important. And then in narrative cinema, at the end where you were showing they were events where narrative was very important. So there's a robbery, there's an escape, there's a man getting hit by a car. So all of these things, you divorced it from narrative, but in fact, in some of these cases, narrative is important, whereas in your own work, there isn't a narrative. You keep revisiting the same event.
See, I find that there's a fight going on in kind of scenes. Like in the Seattle Killers, the robbery scene, there's a real fight between the desire to tell a story efficiently, like to get a lot of story told very quickly in a single shot, and the single shot itself, which makes a claim for materiality, you know, for the agency of a camera, for the materiality of film. So I feel when I watch those clips that there's a real tension between those two desires: the desire of the script and of the studio to tell a story, and the desire of the camera, perhaps the filmmaker, who knows, to not tell a story, but to actually show the materiality of duration, what duration feels like. Try to make it as palpable as possible. So I feel that in any great film, there's that tension. Later on in the sequence, there's I re-edit a scene from Rocco and His Brothers by Visconti, and it's a famous scene. It's a beautiful scene where Gina Lollobrigida and Alan Delon they just met, and I think they've met before, but now they meet alone. She was dating his brother, and she's a prostitute, and they are about to fall in love briefly, and they're sitting across the table, and it's a beautiful scene. They're both perhaps they're both two of the most beautiful actors in the world at this point. But I'm only interested in Gina Lollobrigida, and I cut out all of Alan Delon's scenes. It's a shot reverse. It's a typical shot reverse shot where they cut to each other. And underneath, hidden, it's not very profound, but it felt profound. I felt really moved by it. You know, even the hair on the back of my neck went up. Underneath is a single continuous shot of Gina Lollobrigida that goes on for a minute and a half. I mean, totally continuous. He basically Visconti cut the shot up. So I was saying, I think that in every movie there's this kind of desire for the Lumieres to come back out again. It's in the material. And the single shot is something which causes the narrative to recede a little bit. The longer it goes on, the less force the narrative has.
So maybe this is partly what you mean by cinematic.
Yes. Yeah, and that's the effect of the world. Like I speculate in the text in the book that we've done for the event. I speculate that when the first goers of the cinema came out of the cinema to see the first projected images, would they not have compared their experience to the experience of watching the world go by in a reflection? As simple as that. So that the world going by in a reflection is a long take. It can be as long as you want it to be. Or a camera obscura, or anything where they can see a moving image happening. Or shadows and stuff.
Anyone else? Yes. And I also want to come back to the difference between your emphasis on the extended shot and now you're using montage and compilation. But I think we can come back to that in a minute.
Could the long shot also be this kind of narcissistic?
Could you just speak a little bit?
Sorry. Could the long shot also be a narcissistic idea of the inability to look away from oneself?
A narcissistic idea
of the inability to look away from oneself.
to look away.
I think to look away from the film.
Well, but if you say that the camera is or that cinema is always about itself, or that is the main.
Oh, I see. So you think it's a sort of perfect moment of love, like a kind of self-love.
Yeah, because I suppose what is so fascinating about the moving image, which isn't found in the still image, is that it reproduces life. Like it is the most similar to ourselves. It is the most similar reproduction to ourselves that we have.
Well,
I'm not sure if I agree with that. I mean, in the sense that if you go back to the modernists, what they celebrated very much was the camera, the cinema, the transcending human, and that could seem more in a different way than the human eye ever did. How does that fit?
But maybe that's more like the Ubermensch, that's like the superhuman. So it's like I suppose it's like Ziga Verto's Kinawai, and like
Yeah.
the eye, I mean the camera was still an eye, and effort was still a human element.
See, I think that it's strange that I would turn it around the other way and say that actually, in actual fact, not that the cinema is the closest, you're right, the cinema is the closest to the real that we have in some regards, which actually makes it the least inventive of all the arts.
Awesome.
So you could say that photography invents something that we've never seen before, eventually, which is, actually the very first photographs were condensed movies, right? Because exposures took 10, 20, 30, 42 minutes, so it was a movie condensed into a single image. But eventually, once we agree that there's a moment where still photography becomes close to instantaneous as possible, we see something that nobody's ever seen before, which is the frozen image. Whereas when the cinema is invented, all it shows you is something you see every day, which is what it looks like to see literally a reflection of the world, you know, in reflective form. So there's nothing new in that. There are certain, like the Schlossky clip inside of House on Shoreline High Street, you know, there's certain things, squares, sorry. That, you know, frozen frame and reverse. These are, you know, the freeze frame inside the movie and running the film backwards. It's a famous Lumiere film, the wall falling over and not completely. These are the inventions of cinema, but the invention is not, it's the least inventive, I'd say, of the arts in that respect.
I don't want to hog the mic, but I'm just wondering, but even that to a certain extent, there's a desire that precedes the invention of cinema in the wanting to control time.
Again, I can't disagree that painters for, since the first shadow, Buttati's Potter, some shadow on the wall, you know, there's been an attempt to try and depict time, you know, without moving, time without time passing. That this is to depict the wind, to depict the things that you can't show in stillness, and to depict duration. This has been going on since the beginning of depictive time. So, I can't disagree.
Hi. I was wondering, while I was thinking about the Chardin painting that you were looking at, so the spinning top on the tabletop, and I was wondering whether your observances on what you thought the spinning top was doing tells you anything about what objects, which are placed in a similar way in Chardin's paintings. Do you know anything more about what those objects are doing? I suppose more in relation to traditional painting rather than, but still revolving around the screen or perhaps about the surface. So I'm thinking about the pieces of paper overlapping the edge of the tables and the daggers. If you had, or the rabbit marking out the kind of back wall of his paintings, with the spinning top and what you keep on your kind of focal point to do with the screen within the screen, whether this is, whether you can elaborate on perhaps the relationship of the spinning top, as I say, to other objects in Chardin's paintings.
I think there's something that sounds like you could do that. Better than I. The problem with all these kinds of things, which you also picked up on, is that they become kind of, everything becomes an allegory for mine, main conceit, which obviously robs the painting of all its other accomplishments, and I apologize for that, but I'm not an art historian, and I love Chardin, but I'm not going to make a fool of myself by trying to pretend that I know him well enough to do what you just asked me to do.
Okay, sorry.
Maybe this goes in the same direction as her question, but I was hoping you could talk about aspects of material in your work, because I noticed that in this film essay you showed us that you maybe quite deliberately left the watermark on some of the movie files, and also when you talked about the
I tried to get rid of them, I just couldn't get rid of them.
You just couldn't get rid of them. I thought it was deliberate. And when you talked about the cars and Chatati and the windows, I was also wondering about Strapahulia and history lessons and sort of Brechtian aspects of radical cinema in that sense. And I was hoping you could talk about this. Maybe I'm being presumptuous, but the sense of dialectical materialism in your work, or in the broader sense in cinema, as we talked about it in cinema. Last discussion.
Well, I don't know if I've caught the point quite rightly, and please correct me, but I think there is a very strong sense of materiality, which is there with the interest in reflections and the interest of doubling foreground, or the distance rather than the doubling between foreground and background. Is that the kind of thing you were thinking of? Shadow, reflective surfaces, and so on.
Well, more about the idea of I think it goes in the same direction when you talk about surfaces and projections, and also frames in that sense, which becomes very prominent in these shots of the cities. So, I'm sorry, it's not a question with a direct answer.
Yes, but I mean, I think I'd like to be able to pick that up, and because it brings me back to the point that I've been trying to make, which is that the strong sense of that materiality, whether it's windows or moving reflections or shadows or the presence of the screen, the presence of the frame, only really emerges out of the fact of your compilation. So it's the compilation. Would you agree with me? I can't see you.
Yeah.
That it's almost the point of the compilation is to draw attention to this materiality.
I think, obviously, it's like, I can't remember the moment this, someone said, I feel like I'm going to become, the presentation is going to, it becomes, that I've reduced things to something so banal as the cinema's reflection and framing, and here, these are reflections and framing and effects in the world. But in a way, that's kind of what I'm saying too, that there's something very kind of, it's not just an accident that the cinema is framing and movement in that way. It's because the world, and that goes back to my, when I started the original premise of the feature film we're making called Invention, where there is no commodified moving images. There's no cinema, no television, no MPEGs, but everything's the same. People have mobile phones, people have this advanced technology, computers, internet. But just for some reason, science fiction, Laura frowns a little bit at this, but it's suspension of disbelief, these things don't exist. And it's everywhere in the world is this experience of movement. So maybe there's this idea that this extraordinary worldly experience happening in front of you has made that commodification unnecessary, but there hasn't been a desire for it. And so that's kind of the premise of this whole thing, is that the cinema itself is just a commodified version of a magical experience of the world. And that this magical experience of the world is something that painters and sculptors and photographers have understood since the beginning of depiction.
But is it particularly about the city because of the importance of reflective surfaces?
I think there's a
and the slow but mobile, the comparative slowness of the traffic, which gives it its mobility. And it's amazing the way that Tati actually slows his traffic down so as to make that effect.
I think the modern city intensifies the experience to such an extent that it forces the cinema to be born. That the experience becomes so profoundly visible that the cinema has to happen because it's right there. But I think it's there when you look at Tintoretto, you look at Da Vinci, you look at all depiction. You see the cinema there. You see a kind of cinematic effect already being understood or being rendered or being negotiated. How to depict time and movement, and how to produce an image within an image. How to use the frame. If you think of Jan van Eyck, how to use the frame in the foreground to create an idea of the world moving behind. I mean, these are all happening all the time. And I think all the modern city does is it just intensifies the experience so massively that when we're moving through buildings and moving through space on vehicles, on trains, in cars, we suddenly are forced into a kind of commodification of that experience.
We're going to have to stop now, and I think we're going to, Joey, are you going to invite people?
Sorry.
Just to thank Mark and Laura for a fantastic evening. I'm just bowled over for someone who has the confidence to show their own work among those others. And I personally want to go and see Mark's work more than some of the others, so that's a tribute to that. Thanks to him for organising this evening, Peter for the event as well. And just to say, everyone's welcome to join us for drinks outside and to celebrate Mark's professorial platform. Thank you very much.